list of names, half of them damaged beyond repair, sitting inside a text that almost nobody was allowed to read for 2,000 years. Not a Sumerian tablet, nothing carved in cuneiform, nothing pulled out of the sand near Nippur. This one is written in Aramaic, on fragments so brittle that for decades scholars were afraid to unroll them. It's called the Book of Enoch, and inside it, in a chapter modern scholars now call the Book of the Watchers, there is a list, 20 names, given as the leaders of a group of angelic beings called the Watchers, who according to this text descended to the earth, broke a divine order, and taught humanity things they were never supposed to know. The list survives in more than one version. And here is the detail that keeps drawing scholars back to it. The names don't match. Between the oldest fragments and the later copies, one line moves, one name disappears, and nobody has ever agreed on why. This is the story of that list, what it actually says, what it doesn't, and why. From an Islamic perspective, none of it can be read as a record of real angels disobeying God. Let's start with what this text actually is, because that matters more than anything else in this video. The Book of Enoch is not scripture, is not part of the Quran, is not an authentic hadith. It is a Jewish religious work, written by unknown authors over several centuries before the Common Era, attributed after the fact to the biblical figure Enoch. Scholars call this kind of text pseudepigrapha, writing presented under the name of an ancient figure who did not actually write it. The Book of Enoch was never accepted into the Hebrew Bible, and mainstream Christian traditions rejected it from their canon as well. The one major exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which still includes it in its Old Testament today. For 13 centuries, the only complete copies that survived anywhere on earth were in the ancient Ethiopian language, Guizi, preserved almost nowhere else. Everywhere else, it simply vanished for religious use. Then, in 1947, fragments of it turned up again, this time in Aramaic among the Dead Sea Scrolls found in the caves at Qumran. That part is verified, documented archaeology, no speculation involved. Real fragments, carbon-dated, cataloged, studied by real scholars for the last 70 years. And what those fragments showed was that Enoch had been in circulation far earlier than anyone expected, centuries before Christ, in a Jewish community that clearly took its content seriously enough to keep copying it. So what does it actually say? The section called the Book of the Watchers describes a group of angelic beings who look down at human women and decide to descend to earth. According to the text, they take human wives, and they teach humanity things the story treats as forbidden. Metalworking, weapons, cosmetics, and according to some manuscripts, astrology and the reading of omens. The text calls this instruction a corruption of the earth. It says the offspring of these unions become giants, and it says that the earth's suffering under them becomes so great that it is one of the reasons a flood is sent. If any of that sounds familiar, it's because a short, compressed version of the same tradition appears in the New Testament, in the Epistle of Jude, which references angels who did not stay within their proper domain. That's a real citation, and it's part of why the Book of Enoch never fully disappeared from religious memory, even after it was excluded from Scripture. Later writers still knew the story and occasionally borrowed from it. Now here's where the list comes in. Chapter 6 of the Book of the Watchers names the leaders of this group. 20 names are given, described as the chiefs of the descending Watchers, each one credited with introducing a specific forbidden skill, one for weapon making, one for enchantments, one for the study of the stars, and so on down the list. It reads like an index of blame, as if the author wanted every corrupted skill on earth traced back to a specific origin. And this is the detail that keeps scholars going back to the fragments instead of trusting any single translation. The Ethiopic manuscripts and the older Aramaic fragments from Qumran do not agree with each other. Names shift position. In at least one case, a name present in the Aramaic fragment appears to be missing, garbled, or replaced in the later Ethiopic tradition, and specialists in the field going back to R.H. Charles's early 20th century translation work, and continuing through more recent scholars like James Vanderkam and George Nicholsburg, have spent real academic careers trying to work out which version is closer to the original and why the lists diverge at all. Some of that divergence is almost certainly ordinary scribal error, centuries of hand copying degrade any list of unfamiliar foreign names. But some scholars have raised a more interesting possibility, that later copyists, uncomfortable with a name or its meaning, quietly altered it. We don't have proof of deliberate suppression. What we have is a textual puzzle that has never been fully solved, and that uncertainty is the honest, verifiable core of this video. Not a secret that was hidden, but a manuscript tradition that is never fully reconciled. Before going further, it's worth pausing on something the sensational version of this story usually skips. Scholars researching the Book of Enoch have long noticed that the Watcher's narrative doesn't sit in isolation. It echoes older Mesopotamian material, specifically the tradition of the Apkallu, a group of 7 legendary sages in Sumerian and later Babylonian texts, credited with bringing civilization, writing, and craft knowledge to humanity before a great flood. This is a real, published area of academic comparative research. Scholars such as Helvig Vanvig and Amar Anas have written specifically about the parallels between the Apkallu tradition and the Enochic Watchers, arguing that the Jewish authors of Enoch may have been reworking older Mesopotamian ideas about semi-divine culture bringers into a new theological framework, one where bringing forbidden knowledge becomes a transgression rather than a gift. That's a scholarly theory, not a settled fact, and it's presented here as exactly that, a comparative theory, not proof of a shared literal event. This is the point where it matters to be direct about where Islamic teaching stands on all of this, because the Watcher's narrative, taken at face value, describes something the Quran explicitly does not describe. In Islamic theology, angels are consistently described as beings who do not disobey what they are commanded and who carry out God's instructions without deviation. The idea of angels choosing to rebel, descend, and intermarry with humans has no basis in the Quran or in authentic hadith. So when this video uses the word watchers, it is referring specifically to a category described within the Book of Enoch, a non-canonical, extra-Quranic Jewish religious text, not to any class of beings recognized in Islamic belief. Nothing in this video should be taken as suggesting that fallen angels are a real or accepted concept in Islam. The text is being examined here as a historical and literary artifact, the way a historian might examine any ancient religious document, not as a source of theological truth. It's also worth being clear-eyed about the forbidden knowledge angle, because it's the part that tends to get the most sensational treatment. The Book of the Watchers credits its angelic figures with teaching astrology, charm-making, and the reading of signs in the sky and on the earth. Later Jewish and Christian commentators who engaged with this tradition treated these as corrupting arts, not as legitimate wisdom. The point of the story, within its own religious framework, is that this knowledge was a source of corruption, not a suppressed truth waiting to be recovered. Repeating those claims here is not an endorsement of astrology or occult practice. It's a description of what one ancient text asserts about itself, and it should be understood strictly in that light, as legend within a specific religious tradition rather than as any real body of knowledge. So where does that leave the list of names and the line that doesn't match between manuscripts? Historically, honestly, we don't know why it changed. It could be simple copying error, repeated across a chain of scribes working in a language that wasn't their first over the better part of 1,000 years, in a text that was already considered marginal by the time most of these copies were made. It could reflect regional theological discomfort with a particular name or its meaning, though that remains an open question rather than a documented fact. What we do know, because the physical fragments exist and have been studied, is that this is one of the oldest and best attested textual puzzles connected to the Enoch tradition, and it's the reason serious scholars keep returning to the Qumran material instead of settling for a single translation. What the Book of Enoch ultimately represents is not a hidden record of real events, and not a suppressed source of forbidden power. It's a window into how one ancient community wrestled with the existence of evil, corruption, and catastrophe in the world, and built an elaborate mythological explanation for where it came from, one that borrowed from older Mesopotamian ideas, reshaped them, and was ultimately judged by both Jewish and Christian religious authorities to fall outside the boundary of Scripture. Read as history and literature, It's a genuinely remarkable document, a rare surviving window into pre-Christian Jewish thought, preserved against enormous odds in an Ethiopian monastery and then rediscovered in fragments in a cave by the Dead Sea. Read as theology, particularly from Islamic standpoint, it isn't a record of what actually happened in the unseen world. It's one ancient community's attempt to answer a question every civilization has asked, using the materials and the mythic language available to them at the time. That's the honest version of the list, the names, and the line that doesn't match. Not a secret kept from the world. A manuscript tradition, imperfectly preserved, still being worked out today by people who read Aramaic and Guizi for a living. And a reminder that separating what a text claims from what we can actually verify is most of what real historical scholarship is.